a resentencing hearing for Schaeffer Cox. Schaeffer's serving a 26-year sentence, essentially for free speech. And today we are learning more around why he possibly did or said the things that he did, and some background perspectives. And so we're just going to kind of go through our notes, let you guys know how the morning is going. It's going to be an all-dayer. It might even go into tomorrow, so we don't have any
no sentence yet.
No life-altering news for you yet.
Basically, it's been all Schaeffer Cox all morning long. The Mark Cunningham, who has a stellar resume, one of the top shelf experts in psychology, especially psychology as it relates to criminal sentencing. In fact, he's a recognized expert. He's authored a textbook, authored many articles. He's an expert on the state of Texas. You know, in the state of Texas and some other states, one of the requirements for the death penalty is a statement by a psychologist that the person is unredeemable and will commit further violence if you know that. Where a psychology expert has testified in court that a given person deserved the death penalty because they could not be released without reoffending, and then of course DNA evidence or other evidence showed that the person was actually not rightfully convicted. So psychology is let's just call it an unsettled science.
However, this is an incredibly top shelf individual that we have. So if we could just start with kind of the layout of what's going on in there. Schaeffer was brought into the hearing this morning unrestrained, which for those of you who watched the Rick Kerber case a couple weeks ago, also a man who never harmed a soul and was sentenced to 14.5 years. He was brought in completely shackled, 5-point. Schaeffer
for white collar offenses.
Right. Schaeffer came in a tan jail suit. He has his goatee, very clean shaven, no handcuffs whatsoever. I noticed his cheekbones were fairly sunken and his eyes look pretty dark, very, very skinny. As far as who is in the courtroom, there's room for about 32 people, and we've maxed out the courtroom.
Very small.
It's just
courtroom. About
all supporters, and everybody is. It's great that we're here. And Bill Fulton, two of the informants, we've smiled at them and made sure that they felt comfortable among us. Not really, but
the judge is Judge Robert J. Bryan, a senior judge, and he presides over this courthouse here in Tacoma, the Western District of Washington. He's in his 80s, but he's, in my opinion, he is a Republican appointee. In fact, I think he's a Reagan appointee. Mm-hmm. He's been on the bench a long time, and I've seen quite a few sentencing hearings, and I'll just say this one might even be the best that I've seen regarding patience of the judge for the defense. And the defense has put on this psychology expert, Dr. Cunningham, all morning long for hours, 2 hours. And Dr. Cunningham is sitting there on the stand, really in detail going through his psychological reports about his investigation of the case and of Schaeffer Cox. He interviewed Schaeffer Cox for many hours.
Hundreds of hours, all of them.
Interviewed his family, looked into his background, and
he was retained in 2018. He's testified 400 to 500 times in cases. He's licensed in 16 different states. He's known all over the country. Has won tons of awards that were, among 2,000 and 3,000 different doctors where he's repeatedly received the awards. For going in and trying to determine the two things he is trying to determine is
whether Schaeffer is likely to recommit.
Well, there's two things. Is this a delusional personality disorder, or is this more something based on a political belief? Schaeffer, they diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, delusional personality disorder, and paranoid personality disorder. This doctor has spent hundreds of hours with Schaeffer, Schaeffer's family, Schaeffer's friends, his sister, and his findings at the end were that was a false diagnosis.
The previous diagnosis for the previous sentencing back in 2000, what was it, 11 or 12?
2011 was the original one, and we'd like to note with those three things that Schaeffer was diagnosed with when they locked him up in the CMU, it's important to understand that for paranoid schizophrenia, delusional personality disorder, and paranoid personality disorder, he has never once been medicated. And in fact, he fits no criteria and never has fit any criteria for medication. So if he truly was the things he was originally indicted under, originally labeled with his original indictment, he would have been medicated. I think that's important for people to understand. This isn't just a different perspective. His own history in prisons with everything that he's been through shows that he was not those things, or he would have been medicated all this time.
Now, specifically, Dr. Cunningham is saying that the previous psychological report for Schaeffer Cox was incorrect, and that was, but that that prior psychiatrist or psychologist, Ledoux, diagnosed Schaeffer Cox with paranoid schizophrenic disorder, delusional personality disorder, and paranoid personality disorder. This psychologist this morning, Mr. Mark Cunningham, is saying that that previous diagnosis was incorrect on the basis of this expert's far more in-depth and more detailed analysis.
So there's going to be 3 witnesses today. The doctor who's on right now, and then somebody with the last name of Formosa, who is an investigator. We are still probably halfway through the first witness, so this absolutely could go into tomorrow. I've taken 10 pages of notes. This man spent the first 2 hours of his time on the stand just giving his credibility and kind of going over his own portfolio, and it's actually very impressive. But after all of the testing that he's done, psychological testing, MMIZ, PAI testing, he tried to get the results to review them from the original doctor, and the doctor destroyed them, which was
strange.
Kind of interesting.
Well, I think that's been thrown out there because they're trying to discredit the prior psychology diagnosis. And I'll just sum up to say that this psychologist, professor, or expert is saying that Schaeffer has a lot of issues. He has some psychological quirks and oddities, but he is not mentally ill. He's not a danger. He's not violent and would not likely commit violence in the future if released.
And had he ever committed any violence?
He's never been a violent individual. The doctor concluded, he said the first doctor was incorrect, and he concluded that Schaeffer has extreme beliefs rather than delusions, that his beliefs were shared by eminent people in his circle. They were not isolated in his own head. Those in the sovereign citizen groups, militia groups, while they were improbable, they were also, while they were improbable to have been true beliefs, they're saying that he had about what was happening to him, he did say they were widely held by those in his group. So he wasn't off his rocker crazy. Everybody was sharing these beliefs in these conversations, and Schaeffer kind of stood out and rose himself up as somewhat of a leader to some of these things, which made him be the target versus other individuals, but that many people across this country have the same beliefs as Schaeffer.
And by the way, all of us were sitting in the audience listening to this discussion of Schaeffer Cox's, allegedly psychotic or, paranoid delusions that the government would destroy his life. And we're sitting there looking at him.
It was all delusional, but his life was destroyed by the federal government. I'll quote the doctor that he said after his extensive time with Cox that Cox disavows his prior beliefs, that there was no hitman after him, there was no imminent belief about martial law that he should have held to, there was no threat of a 6-man team, and he no longer displays those same ideas towards resistance. So they are kind of shifting it that was a belief he held, that he actually has an anxiety disorder and some other things, but that a lot of his issues were fueled by the 2 informants, R.J. Olson and Bill Fulton. And had it not been for Bill Fulton and R.J. Olson, Schaeffer would have risen up, he continued to be charismatic, teaching the Constitution, but the conversation wouldn't have shifted the way it did, and they played the audios of the informants saying over and over, I will slit your effing throat if you don't come up with a plan. What is the plan? What if they take your kids? What would you do then? And Schaeffer was literally convicted on him answering a flippant statement to them. Statements like, I don't know, I would probably kill them all if they came and took my family. That doesn't mean somebody is and I don't fight back and protect my family. But those statements were made in the presence of the informants, with the leading of the informants, and Schaeffer Cox ended up going to jail literally for his First Amendment, for having conversations What do you think you would do in a natural disaster? Would you steal from the store down the street if you had no food? I don't know, maybe. Are you going to go to jail now the rest of your life for conspiracy to steal from your neighbor? That's literally as ludicrous as this case is.
And I think that's a pretty good summation. We're going to go back in for the afternoon session. It's lunchtime.
Let me do a quick... They went through how he's been since he's been incarcerated, good mental status, organized cell, good hygiene. While he has a lot of self-victimization, has not proven to be delusional, never received medication, none of his mental illnesses.
You want to mention real quick about the disorder they discussed about all them disorders? There was like 9 of them. No television, no sports.
Oh, that was bad. So they tried to pin why he has some of the things that he has, and the things that they said he suffers from is he suffers from psychological disorder and associated maladjustment. Then they tried to describe why he might have these things. They went into that he embellishes. This doctor says he has a problem with embellishing, conspiracy theories, and whatnot, but that the things that influence him...
Faith, church. His father was a minister.
And
he was homeschooled, and his grandfather. He was homeschooled exclusively, which, according to this psychologist, further isolates Schaeffer Cox from the diversity of views. No television in the home, no team sports, little dating until he was a just expert. Schaeffer Cox developed a psychology where there's goodness inside the tent and evil and danger outside the tent.
Mm-hmm. The psychologist said that he essentially is a very good bullshitter, is what the psychologist said. He's not a threat to the public, isn't going to harm anybody, that he spoke more highly of what he could pull off because he thought he was leading these groups, and when the informants pushed him to talk about violence, he went there when he knows he shouldn't have. Potentially, at least not being said to an informant. When they talk about them being homeschooled, it feeds into a narcissistic behavior. It pushes a child against the idea that they are special if they go to school. So if you homeschool, you're probably ruining your children if you're making them feel special. Social pressure helps to call you out on your stories or your beliefs and be challenged by those around you. And so he was saying these are good. They pointed out that he didn't go into the military and go to college, which is interesting because we hear a lot now about college being the next level of indoctrination. He said had he gone to college, he would have been around peers, shared his ideas about the government, he would have been shunned and kind of put back in his place, and that might have helped suppress some of his ideas that our government might have been doing something to try to harm him. Pointed out, that many of his statements were just simply him being prone to overreact. He was always prone to overreact as a child. If he fell and was bleeding, he'd say, "I'm bleeding to death." Was he really? No. So when he made statements to the informants, those were very consistent statements with who Schaeffer is. What if they brought in guns and tried to kill your children? What would you do? Remember when people talk about how dangerous he is. He said when push came to shove, Schaeffer fled. When Schaeffer believed they were actually going to harm him, he sent his wife and kids away. He went to get a vehicle. He was heading to Canada. He was going to get this vehicle, get his family, and leave. And he said that alone should blow the theory out of the water that his conspiracy was never to harm when he actually thought they were moving in to harm him. He fled. So he said essentially he was like the emperor with no clothes. And he's not a violent individual. He specifically said, I do not see this individual as a terrorist whatsoever. And that's important to remember because a lot of the informants out there want to keep that narrative that Schaeffer Cox is a terrorist, he was going to kill people, but they forget to mention that when push came to shove, he was trying to get his family and get out of here. He didn't want to stay and have a fight with the government. He knew it was a losing battle, and those negative statements came from those informants alone. So that's kind of the picture they're painting, that being overly
heading back in,
that being overly dramatic, is what got him to where he is today. And now we'll head back in.
This morning it has been all Schaeffer. It's been a pretty good day from Schaeffer Cox's perspective thus far. Obviously, this Dr. Cunningham will be cross-examined by the government probably in the next few minutes.
Mm-hmm. And one quote I'll leave you with is that Schaeffer wants to protect his family, doesn't want to use violence. It's a last option. The informants are who were pushed him to say what he would do if violence came. and that the doctor is there to talk about his anxiety levels and how the informants used his anxiety proneness to impact him psychologically that he would have never otherwise made, and that the plan wasn't ever carried out, discussed. It was just a statement of this is what I would do. So please remember that when you're looking at the charges and thinking that they sound really scary to conspire to murder an officer, because there truly was no conspiracy. So
total entrapment.
It was entrapment, pure and simple, because he was a motivational speaker. He was making a difference. People were listening to him, and he wasn't going to play the game that the government was playing. So that's it. We'll come back and do a recap at the end. Hopefully we'll have an answer, but it might go until tomorrow, guys. So just keep praying, please.
Thank you all.